across, the idea that he puts across about selfhood and mind is pretty cool. So I would recommend checking out the first 2 chapters, 2 or 3. Other than that though, unless you've read like everyone else, you could probably give this one a miss. This book was sent to me by an anonymous fan. They chose to keep themselves anonymous. I really hope it wasn't Simon Critchley. I haven't just dumped all over your book, Simon. You know, I did like large bits of it. So yeah, whoever sent me this, thank you. Next up, a book that does citations slightly better, but still not great, and it's Edward Said's Orientalism. If you've not heard of this book, it's an absolute classic. Edward Said wrote Orientalism and it became massively popular. I think he says in his afterword, which is written many years later, more popular than he anticipated. And then he wrote his follow-up book, which was called Culture and Imperialism, which I've already read. Culture and Imperialism is much more accessible to a wider audience than this is. It's about how the East, the Orient, has been portrayed in the West throughout history. Said's great strength is that he's read almost everybody. He's not just talking about how the East was represented in political speeches, but he goes through translations, editions, travel writings, educational documents. He goes through like everything. I think the book is actually quite prophetic in a lot of ways because he's saying that the East has been portrayed in a very limited, negative way, and that people thought they were portraying it neutrally, but because of the socio-political context in which they were writing, they weren't. And some of the trends he identifies in the historical literature and the tropes I still see being reproduced in writing today. So it's a classic for a reason, and it is brilliant. But one of the best bits of advice I ever got when writing is if you're going to introduce somebody like Joe Bloggs, just put a few words in front of their name so that the reader knows who they are. Even if you think they're really, really famous, chances are somebody hasn't heard of them. So don't just say, Joe Bloggs says this. Be like, the philosopher Joe Bloggs says this. And I could have really used that in Edward Said's Orientalism because his great strength is that he's read everybody, where there's a drawback, I think, is that he assumes that you've also read them. So rather than Sir Randall Bloggs said this, what I would have liked would have been Sir Randall Bloggs, who was an 18th century ethnographer and an MP who had a massive influence in the field and wrote Sir Randall Bloggs' fantastically racist adventures to the Orient, okay? And which sold this many copies or whatever. Just something in front of it. And then he said this. So that when he's talking about these texts, I have an idea of how important they were. And because I'm sure if you go through history, you can find people saying all kinds of things. But if Sir Randall Bloggs wrote this book and nobody ever read it, then I don't know why we're talking about it. Whereas if he says, hey, Sir Randall Bloggs, he wrote this. It was one of the most published books in England and it contains this horrifically racist generalisation which everybody thought was true. That's a bit more useful. Lastly, a book that does citations very well, but is, perhaps ironically, the hardest one I have to recommend. It's George Ciccarello Marr's Decolonising Dialectics. The book is about Marxism and where it goes wrong. People who've misapplied it, applied it in limited ways. I found it quite interesting to engage critically with the history of Marxist thought, and that's something that Edward Said does as well. He talks about Marx's own anti-Semitism and about his first world chauvinism. It's complicated, it's tough, it's niche, but what I loved was that Ciccarello Marr took me by the hand and said, this is what this author said, this was the response, this is what I'm saying about it. And it bam, 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 really clear. This is what Sorrell said, if you haven't read him, which I hadn't, so it was really nice to have that primer, that catch-up. This is what the kind of fallout from him saying that was and how that fit into the wider international discussion. This is what I'm saying about it. It was like an experience of being taught, and I didn't understand all of it, but I appreciated that the book was laid out in a way that was still accessible to me. In particular, I read Frantz Fanon's book, The Wretched of the Earth, a few years ago now, and I wasn't really ready for it at the time. And I loved the bits of this book where Ciccarello Marr went through and said, this is where Fanon is responding to Hegel. This is what Hegel was saying, this is what Fanon was saying in response, this is what I'm saying to kind of back it up. And it also left me some room to engage and have curiosities of my own. So he talks a lot about Fanon and assertions of political blackness, and Fanon talked a lot about anti-colonial violence. I might have been curious to hear some stuff about how do we guard against toxic masculinity when we're talking about political violence. Maybe hear a little bit about assertions of political black womanhood as well. George Ciccobello-Mar, I understand, has recently left his university teaching position, so if you want to support him as an academic and as a writer, and the book sounds cool, I'll put a link where you can get his book, and indeed all of the books I've discussed today, in the doobly-doo. Thank you so much to the fans who sent me books from my wish list. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the next video that I make. Bye! Patreon.com/philosophytube helps me pay my rent and make the show. Please consider signing up if you can give me a donation. Or paypal.me/philosophytube is where you can make a one-time donation.